welcome you all this morning to our Campfire on Windows Azure. This is our sixth Campfire, and as you know, with these Campfires, if you've attended one before, we certainly ask that you feel free to participate and ask questions. We'll be doing a short presentation, then after that we'll have a discussion time where we can go over some of the different aspects of it that maybe you'd like to know some more information about. So to get started here, Windows Azure is the cloud platform that Microsoft has for building, deploying applications across a global network. The data centers are spread throughout the world. They're adding some in Australia, I know right now, and we have quite a few in some of the hot spots in the United States, such as in Virginia and in Texas. And Azure was first announced as a community technology preview back in October of 2008, and it then took Microsoft about another year and a half to have something that was commercially available. And Azure is actually a multi-tiered sort of architecture. In fact, it's in standard Microsoft fashion. There's lots of acronyms related to it. The acronym many of you may be most familiar with is SaaS, or Software as a Service, and that's actually the end goal of Azure, is to provide ISVs, especially the opportunity to offer their application to end users. And so that's kind of what you build along with Azure. But there's actually two other layers here, and if you notice, we've got this little graphic here that kind of shows how the layers stack up. Now, I put the information in a little bit different order just so that we can kind of go through it in a more familiar fashion. The layer that many of you may have had some exposure to before is IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service, and this is basically what Amazon is doing right now also with their S3 for storage and EC2 for elastic compute resources, where you can host virtual machines and things like that with Amazon. And basically that's a hardware and operating system sort of VM environment that you pay normally per hour for. Now, what Azure has additionally is a platform as a service, which is something that sits over the IaaS that basically gives you a way of publishing your application. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but one of the key takeaways from it is that it takes operating system management out of your hands and gives that over to Microsoft. So first we want to go over the IaaS a bit more. Now, the interesting part about this is that this is something that Microsoft has only offered for about a year now. Initially, when Azure came out, it was really a platform as a service only environment. The IaaS, or virtual machine hosting, allows you to basically have more management control over your systems. And right now, they actually allow you to host Windows servers, of course, as you would expect, and specifically Windows with SQL Server preloaded on it. But they also give you access to SUSE and Ubuntu Linux, and you can even do some stuff with some custom images on this platform. But like I said, this is a young platform. We'll go into some of the implications of that later on. But you know, initially this was just something that provided PaaS. This IaaS is very immature at the moment. So when we take this to the industry at large for this, our real competition is Amazon with their AWS or EC2. And of course, they've had this IaaS model for quite some time. They've had it since, probably about 2006. So they're a much more mature environment. Now, as for pricing and how Microsoft is competing with Amazon on this, they're actually pretty competitive, and in fact, with Azure, you get this sort of global pricing in comparison to Amazon, who has very regionalized based pricing. And the pricing is different but about the same. The way I thought of it is kind of like if you go into a big box retailer and go to buy a laptop, you may find a laptop from Toshiba, for instance, where the model number is off by like 1 digit, and it offers, you know, maybe a different amount of RAM or a hard drive that's 100 gigs larger or something like that, but they're all at the same price. So it can be a little bit difficult to compare some of the things, but they're very close to each other pricing-wise. One of the things that Azure does offer that's actually very competitive is their load balancing. You can actually set up this sort of load balancing failover environment, and they don't charge anything for it other than the fact that you need to run multiple virtual machines. The other aspect, of course, that can be important is what it takes to get this thing running. Amazon, of course, has many third-party tools and vendor-provided tools that are really a much more friendly sort of system than what you get from Microsoft right now. But where Azure does really take the cake is when it comes to documentation. The amount of documentation that Microsoft has made available for it is actually pretty staggering. It would take you quite a while to read through all the stuff that Microsoft has for the Azure setup and explaining the different pieces of it. In fact, they have so much documentation that you may actually consider that something that can make things difficult, because it can be a bit of a task to wade through some of it. One of the other areas, of course, where Azure has a strong comparison with Amazon is this ability to mix IaaS with platform as a service, the infrastructure and platform mixture. Azure definitely is built on that concept. Amazon does offer some platform-like features. They've got some stuff in relation to like MySQL that you can have available for you on their VMs, but it's a little bit more of a setup where maybe you would get a virtual machine that's already got MySQL on it, and they just have that pre-configured for you. So it ends up being a very thin layer on the IaaS that way, whereas the platform as a service that Azure offers is a little bit richer. So let's dig into that a bit. So the key to this platform as a service is to view it as really these functional items that they're providing for you. And we'll list them all off in a minute, but basically you have different functions for things like SQL Server and various other items. But what that does is it makes it so that right off the bat, my audio cut out? Are you guys able to hear me okay? Someone raise their hand.
Hey, Oliver. Oliver.
Okay, so okay, can you guys hear me okay now?
Hey, Oliver.
Okay, so we'll get back on track here. So one of the things that, as I was saying with this functional interface stuff that ends up occurring is that you end up with a different billing model when you compare this to, for instance, Amazon's setup. With Amazon in general, you're going to be paying for time on the virtual machine. With this PaaS setup,
with Microsoft, you're going to be paying by the units that you're using based on that function. And like I said, we'll spend a little bit more time on that later. The item that I thought was most important here is that this is really a one-way street. So when you sign on to use Azure and start building applications that work against their functional interface, you're essentially buying into Microsoft stack, and you become strongly tied to that stack. You end up with these dependencies that are not easily removed. And so that may be a benefit for you if you're a strong Microsoft partner, or it may be something that you want to carefully consider from that standpoint. But definitely when you compare it to, for instance, Rackspace, who also has some virtual machine hosting, or Amazon, you can move between those fairly easily, but you certainly can't do that with Azure once you're in this environment. So what are some of the actual Azure features that we have here, these functional interfaces? SQL database we'll talk about extensively in a little bit. One of the other ones is media services. Now this is basically transcoding and streaming services for media. So they have stuff like H.264 and MP4 transcoding and streaming services that they offer. They also offer the ability to basically have an Active Directory set up for whatever equipment you or whatever machines you have running in the Azure environment. And we'll kind of take a look at how they show you some of this towards the end when I show you a little demonstration on it. They also offer the concept of websites, which essentially are small virtual machines that are suited just to running websites. Mobile services is basically back-end services for mobile applications. They offer identity management, so log in with Facebook, with Google and Twitter and a couple of the others. Microsoft Live, of course, also. Reporting services is actually an interface to Microsoft's reporting services, which is a free tool that has been in Microsoft SQL Server in recent versions. And they basically offer you the ability to set up these reports as almost this separate area in Azure. That's a little bit different than the way you may have done it if you've ever used reporting services before, but we'll look at that a bit also. This service bus is basically, I call it a messaging broker, and it does that, but it also serves different purposes. They have some stuff related to Windows Communication Foundation, WCF interfaces, and things like that are available for communicating between virtual machines. There's a whole service bus in place just for that. They also have their virtual networks, which is basically to add VPN access so that virtual machines that you set up or services that you set up can act as if they're local on your network. They have big data services, which is basically if you were joined our Campfire, I think it was maybe 3 campfires ago, we talked about NoSQL. They basically have their own solution here, which is Hadoop based, that they give you access to. And then the last sort of functional interface they give you is to storage, which involves blobs, which is essentially files that can be uploaded there. And there's some stuff related to how NoSQL does their storage for the big data piece that's built into what they call their storage service. And then they also have some stuff related to disk I/O and services. So the first piece that we're actually going to talk about is websites and reporting. When you host a website here, essentially we are dealing with a environment where they're giving you a virtual machine that's just been customized in some fashion and that you have limited access to. The website can be .NET based, ASP.NET, or classic ASP even. And you can also host a PHP, Python website, or Node.js, which is a JavaScript based server that they give you access to. And you can see the pricing on this is not bad for a shared site, so one where your site is running on a machine where other sites are also running, comes out to about $10 a month. To get their base dedicated site where you essentially have a dedicated machine for you, you're looking at about $75 a month. So that whole environment with their websites, you can customize it somewhat. Of course, they want you to tie into other services, such as their SQL database service in here. But essentially, they're setting up this simplistic sort of website model for you. It's not something that has a huge amount of redundancy, failover that you can customize to your needs. Some of that's there, but it's tends to be more towards basic websites. Now, if we talk about the Microsoft reporting services, essentially they're giving you this interface to access some of your SQL databases, and you can output reports either in an AJAX format, so essentially they'll give you almost like a website to use for it, or PDF, Excel. They have some other formats that you can output in. And the pricing for this is kind of interesting because they basically charge per hour. So if you run a report, you're going to pay 16 cents for the hour in which it was run, and you can run up to 30 reports during that period of time. If you do more than 30, you get charged another 16 cents. So it's kind of an interesting billing mechanism that they're using here. The hosting is, it mentioned, is different, but the tools are largely the same for the reporting services. So you have access to SQL Management Studio, or you can use Report Designer to set up the queries for the reports. Now I want to move on to the kind of big fish here, SQL database. So this is built on, of course, the standard Microsoft SQL engine that many of us have used and are familiar with, but it truly is a different beast. When we talk about SQL database on Azure, we're talking about an environment that is very customized to a certain type of use case, you might say. They have some high availability built in. You have basically 3 databases that are in sync, your primary one, and then essentially these backup copies that are there for high availability reasons. And when you host a database here, you don't have access to a virtual machine desktop. It is just the database. They give you a dashboard. You can connect to it from SQL Server Management Studio, and you know, that's essentially what you get. There's all kinds of different areas that are missing from a standard SQL installation, but we'll talk about that in just a bit here. The takeaways from this that are important are that there isn't really anything to worry about from a licensing standpoint. When you look at, you know, the number of users that could access this, they don't really have a limit, but they kind of do. They'll tell you that if you're overusing it, you may get kicked from it. But they don't really say what overuse is. It's a very odd environment. And they do support in here sharding or federations, which is the ability to split your database into different regions of the world. If you were hosting a worldwide application, you have access to some of that. Now, there are some very notable limitations in place for SQL Server. First off, each database is limited to 150 gigabytes. Now, what this means is if you needed a database larger than that, literally SQL database is not your solution. It's not going to work for you. They have a very hard limit on that. And in fact, for a standard account, you're also limited to 150 databases. Now, that's a limit that can be removed with actually a credit check of all things. They just want to make sure you can pay for it, and they can raise that limit for you. But the kind of odd part about this that's important to remember is that this is commodity hardware that you're running on. You are not able to control the amount of power that your SQL Server has, the disk I/O that's available to it. None of that's available for your customization in this environment. And when you start reading into the documentation on, you know, how you could use some of this stuff, they mention a lot of the various aspects of this that you have to be aware of, that your application has to be designed for. And truly, it has to be designed for some of these things. For instance, in addition to this size limitation, there are limitations related to how you have to deal with disconnects and reconnects. Although you have very high availability with this, the availability is based on a manual sort of failover mechanism, so that if, for instance, the physical hardware that you're running on goes down, you'll automatically come up on another piece of hardware, but you would have to reconnect from your application. And in fact, they advise you to have very strong, solid reconnect code built into your application. One of the other things that they mention is that because this is running on commodity hardware, you may need to essentially split your database application into multiple databases. They give an example of a website that has an email registration database for a sort of popular website where they talk about splitting just the email table across 3 different databases to try and get the performance you need out of it, because of the fact that this is running on commodity hardware. There are other databases running on the same piece of hardware that you're running on. So this is an important consideration when you're looking at other options, such as either an IaaS hosted virtual machine or a dedicated piece of metal that you host yourself. When you're looking at those different environments there, like for instance a virtual machine that has SQL Server on it, even with Azure, with Amazon, both, you can go in and customize the amount of disk I/O that's available, you know, what kind of processor power and RAM is available to you. All of that is customizable, so that if you wanted to run a very powerful application on it, you can, you know, an application that requires a lot of power. None of that is here. So either your application fits in their model, or you can adjust your model to fit their model, or you need to look at something else. That's kind of where we are with this right now. So for many different users, if you are dealing with, for instance, for some of our customers, if you're dealing with very small end users, this could be a good solution because they may not need a lot of performance from that system. If there's only a handful of users accessing a database at a time, you'll probably be fine here. If you're looking at hosting something where you maybe have tens or hundreds of users hitting a SQL database, this is not the setup that will work for you unless you highly customize it to break apart your databases. And in fact, the virtual machine model that is offered may be a better solution. Microsoft certainly recognizes that by offering virtual machines with SQL Server pre-licensed and usable on it. One of the other things to note here is that online backup and restore right now is not supported. Although your SQL database is backed up automatically, the type of backup that you have is not what you're used to in a standard SQL server. You can't pull down a backup easily right from the system. The sort of live backups that you may be used to happen behind the scenes and you don't have access to it. They also have a required cluster index. For most of us, that's not going to be an issue, but it is a notable difference from true SQL Server. And you can see my advice here is that SQL on a VM may be a better environment for you. The reason I state that is because all of these limitations are kind of a hard pill to swallow the way I looked at it. Most of the systems that we've worked on here that I've had exposure to, I just don't think that what is being offered here is powerful enough. So it's definitely something to be aware of. Now, the one other thing I wanted to mention to you is that Microsoft recently signed a partnership deal with Oracle. And this partnership agreement basically is for hosting of even the Oracle database in Azure. We don't know exactly how that Oracle database is going to be hosted, whether it's going to be a functional interface or a platform service, or whether it's going to essentially be a sort of infrastructure VM that they offer. My guess is that it's going to start as an infrastructure VM that you can just get preloaded with Oracle. Of course, you'll also be able to work closely with Java, Oracle, WebLogic in this environment. So basically, you're getting full support from Oracle in the Azure environment. And in fact, they'll even be offering Oracle Linux. So that's something that literally, if you look at the date here, June 24, 2013, this is a brand new agreement. So there isn't much more detail than that, but if you are an Oracle shop and have been looking for a solution, you know, there is stuff coming along pretty quickly here that you can use for that. So before we get into any questions, I wanted to kind of show you guys what some of this stuff looks like. So this is my little test environment that I set up on Azure. You can see here all the different services that they offer down the left, and I've got a couple of them set up. I've got a SQL database, and you can see here I've set it up on the west coast of the US, and I have a virtual machine that's running, and I have a cloud service. Now this sort of cloud service is actually related to how they handle some of their virtual machine load balancing. So now that I have this cloud service in place, I could actually go into my virtual machine here and set up what they call an availability set that essentially would give me access to load balancing built into that environment. So it ends up being this pretty easy to work with environment that they give you here. I also have a storage area here with some limited stuff set up, and you can see it's all very area-based. Now, some of the things that's missing, like for instance in the storage area, this is where I would set up things like blobs, which would be file uploads and some of that stuff. That isn't something that you actually have access to from this web interface, although you can set some of it up. One of the limitations, and kind of showing how some of this is in its infancy, you can't upload files from their web interface. You literally either have to use a third-party tool, which I haven't found one that works very well yet, or write actual code to upload files to them right now. So there are some limitations there. What I wanted to show you, in addition to that, is in the VM, we've been working on adding Azure support into Mertech drivers, and I kind of wanted to show you how that's coming along. This here is an Azure VM. It's running on not their smallest VM size, but next to the smallest, which gives you a single core and about 2 gigs of RAM. And as you could see over here, I'd set up a order entry database, our standard order entry example, as excuse me, a SQL database. And then in an Azure VM, I installed the order entry example, and basically with a latest version of Mertech driver that we're doing some testing with, going to connect to that Azure SQL database, which is truly different. There are pieces of it that just aren't there in SQL database that required some changes from us to make it compatible with Azure. So, but we've got that working. And you can see here I'm logged into the order entry example. I can page through records. Now, one of the things to note here, this is a West Coast VM, US West, and the database is a US West database. I have not set up what they call an affinity group, which can give you a little bit better performance by almost treating the database and the VM as if they're on some sort of private network together. But these are literally being hosted out of the same facility right now. And you can kind of see some of the limitations here. It's a little bit hard to illustrate, but if I start paging through records, on your screen you may be seeing just various records appearing and not necessarily seeing all of the records pop up as I'm hitting the F8 key in this case through some of that. I'm seeing the same thing you are in that case. That isn't anything to do with GoToWebinar. When you start using some of this stuff, you'll realize that the performance that you get out of that SQL database, although it is not horrible, it isn't spectacular either. There is many milliseconds of lag on a request here that if you had a SQL database running privately on your network, you wouldn't see any of that. So even if you're hosting it on the Azure environment, going against that standard SQL database can be very slow. I could imagine a handful of users accessing a database like this. You know, of course, the order entry example is just a few megabytes of data. So I can see that being the case, but if you had a much larger database or we're going to have many more users, even if you hosted all of your users in that cloud environment, it's not very great performance. So it is functional right now. The performance, we've also been able to test this with a remote client where basically I'm running the order entry example on my local PC and accessing the Azure server, and of course there's significantly more lag in that case just because of the internet being in between, but it does work, and you get round trips of like an order entry coming up somewhere around about 200 milliseconds is what I'm seeing to bring up a full order entry and all the detail items. So it's something that maybe you could have some use for, but you certainly have to be aware of that extra lag time, which is the case in many environments. So anyways, that's something that we've been working on. I did want to give you guys a chance to talk about this a bit, so let me pull back up here into our slides, and I think now we can kind of talk about some of the questions you may have here. Does anyone have anything they wanted to see specifically or were curious about? Okay, here. Looks like we have one. You can, here, let me unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
So have there been significant outages with the SQL Azure services?
Still can't hear you. You have the right microphone selected.
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Let's see if we can hear it.
Have there been significant outages on any of the SQL services?
There actually have been a few notable outages, and that, of course, can be very important here. When you're looking at this, you have to consider what kind of uptime you're guaranteed from the vendor. For a lot of this, they actually guarantee right at 99.9%. That gives us somewhere around 42 minutes per month of downtime that is acceptable to Microsoft on this. Back in February of 2012, we had a problem with a leap day calculation that caused a system outage. In July of last year, there was some piece of equipment on a network that also caused about a 2.5-hour outage over in Europe. And then the one that actually kind of is the most worrisome in my mind was in February of this year. They had a worldwide outage that actually lasted quite a while. I don't know exactly how long, but it was basically a SSL certificate that they had let expire, and it took down all of Azure worldwide from that outage, which of course was, you know, an oversight by an individual on renewing an SSL certificate. That's not the sort of thing you want to have that can bring down an entire worldwide cloud. So from my standpoint, there definitely is some room for improvement from them there. I know Microsoft has been working on that quite a bit recently to improve the reliability and to get processes in place that stop some of these things from happening or stop them from spreading. Now, Amazon has also had their notable outages over the years. And in fact, we hear about those a little bit more regularly because of some of the big customers that they have using the Amazon services, such as Netflix and some of these others that are just so huge that when Amazon has an outage, you know, we hear a reported outage from 4 or 5 major vendors. Azure has, you know, pretty good penetration into the Fortune 500, I believe, somewhere around 50%. And so from that standpoint, if they have a big outage, we may hear something about it, but a lot of times the services that are being used by these Fortune 500s are non-critical or internal services, so some of that just doesn't make it out there. Okay, let's try again.
Unmuted.
Let's try again.
Got another question here.
Can you hear me?
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No.
No.
Can chat the question
here. Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you use Azure Vm to host a terminal server for client access?
That's kind of an area that you have to consider what you're attempting to do. Of course, you can, like I said, very powerful VMs, and they do offer a way of doing that. The area where that comes in is in relation to what Microsoft calls their service provider license agreement. And basically what's available is you can purchase what's called an RDS SPLA license, which essentially is a remote desktop service license from a reseller that can be set up on a hosted terminal server. And essentially that gives you a way of hosting terminal services clients. It's a little bit too complicated to go into here, but it is possible. It's one of those things that if that's what you want to do with it, you should probably talk to Microsoft about it also to kind of discuss the details of what you're wanting to do. Another question I know that some people have had is in relation to where their data centers actually are. I mentioned in Virginia and out here. The U.S. data centers are in Chicago, San Antonio, California, and Virginia. In Asia, they've got Hong Kong and Singapore. Europe has one in Dublin and one in Amsterdam. And as I mentioned early on, they're also planning data centers in Sydney and Melbourne, Australia. So there will be a couple over there also. The other area that for me was a concern as I was going into this, especially with, is especially related to security. I know that some people have been a little bit worried about the security of these vendors. They seem to be a little loose with everyone's data, as we've seen all these data losses over the years. Microsoft has taken some interesting tactics to deal with some of this. Part of what they've done is they've handled network segmentation, so that basically when you set up a Azure environment, you are segmented from all other Azure customers and don't have access to any of their servers or anything like that. So that ends up being, you know, one way of handling it is that essentially each customer is on their own private network that way. Another thing that they've done is to put in place these, basically, of course, they have encryption in place for their various messaging protocols. But they've also set up, like, all of these SQL databases with firewalls in front of them. So, for instance, if you go and set up a SQL database and want to give access to it from a specific client, you have to allow access for that specific client or for that specific IP address, rather than it just being an open sort of SQL server that any authentication would get you into. So having this this firewall in front of each one of them is another protection measure they put in place. The other thing that they've done is in dealing with customer data from the standpoint of Microsoft personnel, essentially all of their support work and everything that they've done limits access to all the customer data by Microsoft personnel. So even if you're having a problem in your environment and need help, they don't have access to the data on your server. They have access to information about the machine that it's running on, and they have the ability to move you over to a different machine, but they can't help you with your data at all when you talk about that. So that stops the issue of Microsoft personnel being able to peer into your data. they've essentially blocked access to that for all of their personnel. Now, of course, that's essentially their word that you have to accept for that, but they, in general, they don't want access to that sort of stuff. The risk to them is just as high as it is to you from that standpoint, so they are very careful about that.
There are a couple of questions. There's one from Todd, which is probably more important to people. How would they deploy their VDF application on Azure? So his question is specifically about VDF web apps.
Gotcha. VDF web apps are not something that are easily deployable on Azure right now. A standard VDF application could be deployed in the platform as a service environment with some amount of work. There's some possibilities for that. But for a standard VDF application, looking at it from a platform standpoint, not really doable right now. If you look at it from actually doing a standard VM with it, though, you could, of course, install Web App Server on a standard VM and access it that way without any problem at all. And of course, that's essentially the way you'd set it up on any other machine. You know, the VM is going to be something that you manage fully yourself, and you can install whatever software you want on it. So, you know, you can throw IIS is already on there, and so you can throw Web App Server on there easily.
Yeah, the question from Chuck is, have you tried Azure AD for authentication?
I haven't tried the AD authentication stuff from Azure at all. Of course, it's essentially some of you know, standard Active Directory authentication that they're giving you access to with some tweaks to it. So I'd imagine it would work very well. Of course, that's, you know, Active Directory is essentially a hopped up LDAP server that Microsoft has done, you know, custom authentication services for. So, but I haven't played with that.
Okay. So, Oliver, what is the really? I mean, how useful is Azure for VDF developers? In what context can they use it? So.
Well, I think you have to look at it really from the standpoint of how does it compare with what else is available out there, and from the standpoint of comparing it to Amazon or Rackspace, for instance, really you're comparing very similar items. You can set up a VM, put your application on there, and do whatever you want with it from there. So if you wanted to, if it's a thick application, of course, then you have to deal with all these terminal services issues and the special licensing. But you have to do that same thing with Amazon. You have to do that same thing with Rackspace. So, you know, from that standpoint, you know, I think it's basically just a way of dealing with a different licensing model and a different sort of model from the standpoint of hardware. The platform aspect is what really sets Azure apart, and for VDF right now, that platform aspect isn't, I don't think, a very good match. There's some stuff that can be done to make it better, but you know, I don't see that happening very quickly. It's something that you know, I've been looking into a bit, but you know, those other services such as the reporting services and SQL services, I just don't think are quite powerful enough or ready for what a lot of the VDF developers are doing. The VM stuff, though, you know, is right on par with what Amazon has to offer, and in fact, the disk I/O that they give you is a little bit higher end than what Amazon has. So if you were going to host a SQL server on it, it's going to be a little bit faster than Amazon's in a apples to apples VM environment. So you know, that's kind of a plus.
So really, the best way for deploying, you cannot use the platform as a service for VDF app, right? Is that because they require .NET based solutions primarily?
Well, it used to be that was the reason why. Recently, that's not really what's causing the issue anymore. The issue now is that the environment that it takes to set up a platform-hosted cloud service is very, very complex. If you're not using basically Visual Studio or something like that to build the setup for you, some people have done it with Perl, and single directory install is certainly possible. But the platform as a service stuff has to be web-based. Okay, it's not for thick clients when you're looking at that. It's only web-based stuff. and setting up web app server to work in that environment would be a complex undertaking.
But will it work out of the box? Will web app work out of the box on that?
On the VM piece of it, yes. On the platform piece of it, no.
Okay.
So if you just host it in a VM, you'd be fine. If you want to actually host what they call a platform service, a cloud service, no, web app cannot be used for that. What I found interesting in some of this stuff that I think is kind of important to this question is what I call combos. There are many combos that you can set up in Azure that can be kind of interesting. For instance, if you were to set up a VM, running some web services, for instance, in VDF, along with a their website service, their SQL service, and their virtual networking service, that combination, that combo would give you the ability to deploy an internal app with a web front end in Azure. So, there are some of these combos that can be quite powerful. If you had a VM along with SQL services and reporting, that could be just like a standard app hosting environment, if you can throw your reporting into their reporting services. So there are some of these synergies that you get that way that could be beneficial.
Chuck is making a comment here that they have a federated server using direct sync with Office 365 and want to use Azure. Okay, so that's a pretty complex setup there. I don't know if you can get Chuck on audio.
I think so.
Hey, go ahead.
Hey, Chuck.
Try it again. Is it working now?
Yep. I can hear you.
Yeah, that was my problem. Yeah, I mean, it's we already have that direct sync set up with Office 365, and I'm looking to use either the federated server in-house to do WF Trust type RESTful services, to do Active Directory authentication, or I've just been reading about the new identity management features in Azure that just rolled out. They're actually kind of in beta right now, that you can actually let Azure do your authentication no matter where the user's from. So to me, it's ideal for web apps because it could be outside the firewall, log on to the web application, and have Azure do the authentication.
Yeah, definitely. That could be an interesting combination where you set up a VM but then use their front-end authentication services.
That's the way Link and Microsoft the Outlook and all that work right now. It uses Azure's Active Directory authentication, so you can log on from your phone, from your iPad, anywhere, and you don't have to be connected to your network at work to authenticate.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm curious to see how that if you dig into that, how that goes.
I think it's ideal for web apps because that's the missing piece right now in the Dataflex web framework is there's no authentication built in there, and it's not easy to do it. And because most of the stuff in Microsoft is .NET based. Since we're not .NET based, there's we're missing that critical part.
Yeah, definitely.
That's it.
All right.
Did Todd have another question here too?
No, it was the same question we had before.
Okay.
Yeah, he's unmuted, but I don't think he's maybe he doesn't have a mic there.
Yeah. And looks like maybe there's something from Sean. Hey, Sean, I unmuted you. Maybe just go ahead and ask your question.
I didn't ask a question.
Oh, no?
No.
It's got the little icon for me that says that you have an unanswered question. So.
Oh, no, I was just telling you I could hear you when other people couldn't hear you. I can think of a... No, I can't think of a question. Oh, sorry.
No
sorry,
problem.
everyone.
No problem. Okay.
Now, the one scenario that we have seen one of our customers is trying to do is use a SQL backend, a SQL Azure as the database only, and connecting from, I guess, a mobile front end, and then going through a web application framework that's also going to run under a VMware. Oliver, is that kind of the scenario they're looking at?
I believe so. Yeah, that's kind of what they're looking at doing, you know, like that's the sort of environment that for me right now I'm pretty I'm a bit unsure of advising people to do that because of the fact that you are running on such commodity hardware with the standard SQL databases. So if you, like I said, if you had these small customers that you were hoping to host that way, I think there's some ability to handle it using this. But if your customer had any amount of strong usage, or if you had some pretty intensive reporting on the back end, things like that, the SQL database piece of it just it's just not powerful enough right now.
So really, I mean, for most Dataflex developers, using the Azure as the infrastructure as a service is really the best way to go. Even if you use the SQL database on Azure and you have to run your VDF under a VMware, the performance is still not there. As if you were to run the SQL server inside your VMware, that would be much better.
Correct. Yeah, because you can, in that case, I mean, it can be just as slow if you buy a, if you get a low-end VM, but their VMs are, they have very scalable stuff that way, and you can buy a pretty high-end system that with strong disk I/O and all of that, so you end up with a good environment. The other thing that's nice about that is that you don't have that sort of one-way lock-in to Azure then. That VM is something that you can essentially export and bring into a different environment, and since you wouldn't be using these platform services that Microsoft offers, it kind of deals some of that lock-in issue there. So I think that's a pretty good setup using their IaaS VMs.
And cost-wise, how does it compare using the VMware on Azure versus a virtual machine on Azure versus Amazon?
It's very close. The comparison's difficult because they base it on different things. Microsoft has a couple of little tweaks that they've done that make the pricing competitive, a little bit more competitive in some very specific cases. For instance, they do down to the minute billing rather than full hour billing like Amazon does. If you have temporary VM usage, that could be an issue for you. If you needed a really high-end VM for a short period of time, for instance. One of the other areas that there's a difference is in, like I mentioned, their disk I/O. With Azure, you get they consider this all IOPS, or input-output operations per second. With Amazon, you get basically an average of 100 IOPS that can burst up to a higher amount for very short periods of time. And then you can purchase higher-end disk I/O access all the way up to somewhere, I think, in like the 4,000 IOP range, which would be what you would need for a high-end database server, very high-end database server in that case. With Azure, you get, on even their lowest-end VMs, you get 500 IOPS per machine, but you can kind of spread those across multiple disks. So for instance, with their lowest end VM, you get a single disk. With the next one up, you get access to 2 disks, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, up to like 16 terabytes for their basic setup. That's a real high-end VM though, and each one of those gets 500. So in fact, on that one, without paying anything more than what you get for the standard machine, you have something like 8,000 IOPS, but it's spread across 16 disks. So they've done some of those sorts of things to make it a little bit unique. But other than that, their pricing is almost down to the penny the same as what Amazon is charging per hour.
Yeah, I think there's a comment from Chuck. Chuck, you should still be online if you want to comment.
Oh, my microphone's on?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. They also on the SQL Server storage, the Azure SQL Server, they'll give you a discount if you got a database that gets big at one point, and then after a while you go in and clean it up, or then they give you a discount on that storage. It's pretty much per day or per hour. I don't remember. I think it's an hour basis, so you can save some money there.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, they're actually really reasonable on their policies with a lot of this stuff, from what I found. When you're looking at how you charge for reports or for identity services or Active Directory, all of that stuff, some of it's kind of hard to even imagine what they would charge based on, and so they tend to be pretty generous with some of that stuff, since it's hard to come up with how you would bill for some of those services other than an hourly standpoint, but they have come up with other billing methods, and they're very reasonable.
Well, Oliver, have you tried setting up I saw you have a VM there running
Yeah.
with a Dataplex application on there, and you were connected up to a SQL server that was, as you said, you hadn't set up an affinity for that yet.
Yes.
In the Amazon environment, if you set up a virtual private cloud, then you can launch a remote data store as SQL Server or MySQL or Oracle, and you launch that into your VPC, and you have backbone performance between your instance and the database, and it's incredibly fast. I mean, is that not a concept in Azure where you could have that SQL Server running there in that zone with your VM?
Actually, they have that up to like 10 gigabits, I think. It's it looks just like what Amazon can do there, where you can kind of link those together. But the problem here is not the network I/O. I mean, like I said, we're getting just a few milliseconds of round trip in this environment, which isn't bad actually. I mean, yeah, if you're running your own server, you're going to get sub-millisecond, but that isn't network I/O that's killing us there. Is what that means. It means it's the fact that we're running on this very commodity hardware that, they even mentioned could be running up to dozens of other SQL servers on one piece of metal.
Okay.
So that's what's really causing the issue here. We are on a shared resource, and those resources are not high end, and that's why they tell you to set up lots of databases, and they talk about breaking applications up into 10 or 20 pieces even, so that not all of your network I/O is coming, or all of your SQL I/O essentially is coming from one server. It's coming spread across all these different machines. And when you set up multiple databases that way, it spreads them across multiple physical machines automatically. So you end up with, but that complicates your authentication. It complicates your your application setup, all of that, when you have to go and access 10 databases. I mean, it's possible, but it's more difficult.
How would we do that in a VDF environment? I mean, even in Mertech, I mean, you'd have to have connection strings to all those databases,
Right.
or they look like one big database?
No, you have to have connection strings to all of them. Like I said, it's complicated. It's possible, but complicated. So that's why I thought, why I'm really saying this IaaS, setting up a VM, putting SQL Server on there is a better environment overall, because you don't have to deal with those issues. You can set up a powerful SQL Server and use it that way. And certainly, they even mention that in a lot of their documentation. We're gonna send out along with the slides, links to some very important articles that talk about this. One of them is this really, really long article, probably, 30, 40 pages long, that goes over all of the different implications of using just SQL database, just that one piece of it, and what that means for your application. My takeaway from those 40 pages is that, I wouldn't want to deal with all of that. I would much rather deal with setting up a more powerful VM in a virtual, with SQL Server on it.
Well, the real advantage to the Amazon model with the virtual private cloud is that you don't have to host your SQL Server database on your public-facing VM. So you can have your database inside the virtual private cloud, out, not accessible from that VM. So that was a situation where you have a SQL database sitting there on a public-facing, site, and you're subject to all kinds of SQL injection, exploits and that kind of stuff. So
yeah, definitely. So yeah, I mean it's a different it's a different world that way.
I guess the advantage I see is that a lot of people, even if you go with Amazon, you still need to understand some of the networking concepts and how to set up things. Whereas with Azure, you can go with their platform as service. Of course, it's not in the context of Dataflex, but you don't need a networking experience to get these services set up and going.
Yeah, overall, I'd say that's the direction they're heading with it. I don't think they've quite made it there yet. Like I said, a lot of this is new, so I think they're definitely going that way with it. They're trying to get rid of the management of various things. They can tell you, they tell you that at any time your SQL server might go down for either hardware reasons or upgrade reasons. They don't give you notice if they're going to pull these things down to do a software patch on them or anything like that. That just occurs for a lot of this stuff. So they're taking all of that out of your hands. They're taking some of the networking out of your hands, and essentially just trying to give you an environment where you can host your application. I don't think they're quite there yet.
I will say that the one advantage that Microsoft really does is their identity management. Again, I'm talking about this Active Directory, but it's their entire identity management features that they have built into Azure that is a huge advantage over Amazon, because you have to build all that for yourself within Amazon.
Yep. Yeah, I can definitely see that. These platform services, even the stuff related to media services, if you're in that sort of industry, that would be a huge advantage to not have to build all of that. So providing these functional interfaces, yeah, there are some that are more valuable than others, but having those available at all is, a big advantage. And from Microsoft's standpoint, it's their big lock-in, which is great for them. So, I think they're headed down the right track with that.
And also, it makes sense for Microsoft because they're not about to give up their Windows licensing. So I think that their approach is that they're more application-centric. So identity management is more tied to application than infrastructure, not necessarily always in that way. So I think that what they're trying to do with, like they did with Office 365, is to somehow keep the Windows licensing model there, because Windows licenses will go down on the desktop or on the servers, but they're going to make it up by allowing you to deploy application but continue to get the revenues from these in the long term, because that's going to be a big hit for them if all of a sudden people stop using Windows and move to the web. The number of desktops go down significantly.
Not just for Microsoft. I think Data Access is looking at that same revenue model.
Well, I mean, there is a whole philosophy. I mean, the issue simply is, and we have dealt with this with our product also earlier on, is that just because you're using a browser, does it make your application any cheaper? And the answer may be no. I mean, it's a different kind of application, and so in an intranet, if you start using browser, certainly you're going to take a big hit. That's why from the beginning, we have done our driver licensing based more on process, because internally the process is just a runtime. And you might have 5,000 IIS users, but you might be using 100 processes, right? So, yeah, it's always challenging, and it's not going to be easy. And if you take a hit, if you don't price it correctly, you could destroy the company, And for Microsoft, it's a big deal because all of these things, the Office and Windows are the main revenue drivers. And if people are using more and more mobile stuff or Google apps or whatnot, it's going to be difficult for them to convince new generation of users to use Word, and that's going to be a challenging thing for them. Anyway, I think we have reached our time. Thanks everyone for participating. Always a pleasure to have you all. We'll announce the topic for the next webinar soon. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us. We'll be happy to share our slides, as well as the recording will be made available. So if you want to see the recording, please send us an email, and we'll provide that for you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye now.